Pressuring your opponent is the cornerstone of fighting in Fortnite, but there are many ways to pressure your opponent, and the majority of fighting deaths are caused by incorrect pressure, so let's break down how to pressure your opponent, how to counter good pressure from your opponents, and much more, so let's go. Before we get into all the mechanics of how to apply pressure onto your opponent, let's first understand why putting pressure onto your opponents is really important. To consistently and reliably win fights in Fortnite, you need to be setting up right shoulder peak so that you can shoot your enemy from it while making it very difficult for your enemy to shoot you back. This is pretty hard to do when your enemy is just doing this. This means that we have to apply pressure onto your enemies in order to get them to move out of their box, which you can react to, or for you to catch them in their own box by setting up a right shoulder peak, allowing you to safely clean up the fight. So let's take a look at the different ways that you can pressure your opponent. So, you're on the offensive and you start to approach your opponent's box. Do you pressure him with a pickaxe or a gun? Well, the pickaxe has the advantage of being able to break walls faster than most guns, and the pickaxe doesn't need to reload, so you can apply pressure for a long period of time without having to stop and reload your gun. The biggest downsides of a pickaxe though is that one, your range that you can pickaxe a wall from is relatively small, and when you go to pickaxe a wall, you telegraph exactly what you're going to do right before you start to pressure your opponent's wall. This means that good players can know exactly what you're about to do and make a much easier decision on how to eliminate you. That's the pros and cons of using a pickaxe, but what about using a gun? Well, when spraying at your opponent's walls, you have significantly more range with your ability to pressure your opponent's pieces. This allows you to take more specific long-range peeks that are much safer than sitting right on a wall. The other advantage to using a gun to pressure your opponent is that it is significantly harder to tell when you're going to shoot your weapon because there's no animation to spraying your gun, as it is instantaneous, unlike the pickaxe. The two main downfalls of using your gun are that you have to reload, which can give your opponents time to heal or make a play back onto you. The other downfall to pressuring your opponents with a gun is that with most guns, it is slower to break a wall than a pickaxe. So guns have the advantage of range and a lack of predictability, but the pickaxe has the advantage of speed and consistency and pressure. Let's look at some ways you can use them both. The right shoulder peek is the cornerstone of basic Fortnite fighting, and when applying pressure to your opponents, this doesn't change at all, but right shoulder peeks go beyond the simple peanut butter edit. When you're pressuring your opponents, make sure that you are always to the left of them so that in turn you can pressure your opponents from a right shoulder peek. Here are a few quick right shoulder peek setups that will work very well. The first setup starts by placing a wall and a ramp here, one tile to the left of your opponent, and then swinging your pickaxe or shooting your gun at the opponent's wall from this diagonal peek. This gives you a good right shoulder peek while keeping you relatively protected. The next setup starts by placing these two walls diagonally from your opponent. From here, you want to edit the wall to the right of you. I see a ton of players mess this up by editing the left wall thinking that they are on a right shoulder peek because of the peanut butter edit, but if you look at this peek from a macro scale, it becomes very obvious that you're peeking to the left. So make sure that you edit out the right wall, and from here you can spray your opponent's wall and try and take it off. The final setup that we will look at before continuing on is the classic box fight peek. This happens more often in endgames where you pressure your opponent's wall from a tile away behind a peanut butter edit. This is really good at applying quick pressure while keeping yourself very safe from third parties, but it is very easy for your opponent to escape away from the setup if they have any room to work with. Anyways, now that you understand how you can apply pressure safely, let's look at how you can actually apply pressure to more aggressively close up fights. Proper spacing is probably the largest mistake that players make when trying to pressure their opponents. Spacing at its core is the distance between yourself and your opponent. When pressuring your opponent, it is very important to be thinking about the spacing between yourself and your enemy constantly, as you want to collapse in on your opponent, but you do not want to put yourself in a position where you can be boxed up. But at the same time, you want to close the space gap between yourself and your opponent so you can finish off the fight very quickly. If you have an HP advantage and are trying to close out a fight, you want to put yourself within one tile of your opponent, but with protection. This means that you shouldn't ever just drop straight onto a ramp or cone without giving yourself a proper escape route by creating counter piece control. From these close spacing positions, continue to apply pressure until you can either get a very large HP advantage or force your opponent out of his current box. If you can get a large enough HP advantage, typically 100 HP or greater, it becomes worth it to jump right into your box, closing the space down to less than one tile. Let's say that your opponent moves out of his box though, and with that, we'll look at the final step of pressure. There are two ways to pressure your opponents with builds. The first is simple, and that's the cone slide. You used to be able to phase any build through your opponent's wall, putting them in an uncomfortable situation, but this was recently fixed. But if your opponent doesn't have a center piece in their box, and if their box is at least one tile off the ground, you can look below their box with your cone and place a cone inside their box. This will put pressure onto your opponent and put them in a spot where they're forced to leave their box or waste time breaking the cone that you just placed. Now let's take a look at the final way to pressure with builds, and that is with exit control. Exit control is the process of creating piece control in the directions your opponent is editing out of. If I'm going on my opponent's wall, I know that he can try to edit out the top through his cone and floor, go down through his floor, or out any of his walls. It is impossible to know exactly what direction the opponent is going to go, but if the opponent has been properly pressured and forced out of his box, you'll have to pick some direction that he will indicate with his movement. Once you know what direction a player is going, you can quickly create piece control here and force your opponent into your pieces where you can quickly finish off this fight. Now that we've done a comprehensive guide on how to pressure your opponents, let's take a look at how to counter some pressure. There are two main ways to counter pressure: spacing and counter shots. Let's first look at spacing. In contrast to when you're trying to pressure your opponents, when you are being pressured, you want to make space away from your opponent. This means going in the direct opposite direction from where your opponent is pressuring you from to create the longest distance away from your opponent. This can give you more time to heal, to put yourself back in the fight, and give give yourself more time to look for the second way to counter pressure, which is counter shots. If you're being pressured, it is an absolute must that you are using counter shots to your advantage. This means that when your opponent makes a mistake by either swinging his pickaxe or taking an over aggressive angle, you need to make a quick edit, hit a shot, and then reset. The other way to get a good counter shot is to wait until your opponent breaks your wall, and you want to time your shotgun shot in the small window between when your opponent breaks the wall and replaces it with his own. In this small window, you can hit a shot, but it is very risky because your opponent is much more likely to take your wall in this scenario if you go for a timing shot, so you need to be prepared to get out of the box as soon as possible. Understanding how to pressure your opponents is one of the most core aspects to improving your fighting skill, and you can learn everything there is to learn about pressuring, but the best way to improve is to actually use it in game and try to work on pressuring specifically. If you want some more advice on how to improve your fighting, go check out the video on screen.